So, all right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Navionics webinar series tonight with Tommy Skarlis. I want to send out a special thank you to Crappie Masters for helping us with this webinar and posting up about Tommy's webinar this evening on trolling jigs for crappie. A great organization and really appreciate their help. Tommy sent me a laundry list of things to kind of talk about his achievements, but we only have an hour, so these would probably take about 50 minutes to roll through. So we're just going to go with it. I'm going to take my little cheat sheet here. We're just going to go with it. Tommy is the one I did not know is the world record holder for the largest professional walleye tournament total weight. 3-day total of 15 walleyes at 138.28 pounds. That's a lot of big wallies, but quite a few. 2013 Crappie Masters Champion. Aim Lakes winner. You placed what, I think second place in the last Crappie Masters tournament, right, Tommy? Second or third?
Second in the Florida State Championship.
Second in the state champion. So Tommy certainly is one of the best in the world as far as fishing. So I appreciate you, Tommy. Appreciate Tommy taking time out for us. So just real quick before we turn it over to Tommy, if you've got any questions, usually the webinar runs about an hour, but usually save the last 20 minutes here for question and answer period. So if you've got any questions, you're going to see on your box, I believe it's at the top for those that are attending, a little chat or a question and answer. If you've got anything, please go ahead and type any comments you've got, and we'll save the last 15, 20 minutes to answer those. So without further ado, Tommy, if you want to give away your secrets.
Well, we're going to let it rip, guys, girls. This is something that we've just started to get our hands around as far as trolling jigs for crappies. Now, back in the 2013 National Championship, we were using crankbaits. But just recently, we've had quite a few successes. In 2015, a year ago, we placed second at the Florida Tabari's Crappie Masters event. And then, as Paul had mentioned, this year we got second place in the Florida State Championship out of the St. Johns River. Entirely different body of water, but you know, the one thing that I'm really learning as years go by is that crappies, no matter where they're located at, are still crappies. And we found that out with ice fishing. Now we're finding that out with open water crappies. And what's interesting is that in Florida, they said that crappies can't get caught on crankbaits. But I think what the situation or the issue is with Floridian crappies, or black crappies specifically, is that those fish are really high up in the water column. And most crankbaits that are trolled go deep in the water column. And when I mean high up in the water column, I mean 6 inches to 2 foot right underneath the surface. But in Florida, you know, we were able to really get her clicking. We're starting to get our hands around this even more. And even with my personal best crappie, one that was just a little bit over 3 pounds, that came on trolling jigs. Now, everybody is good during the spawn. And I don't care if you're up in Minnesota, which is what I'm showing you here with Red Lake, or if you go to any body of water down south. Fish are in knee-deep water. They're easy to find. They're relating to structure. They're going to be a little bit more susceptible to anglers running into them. Biggest question I get all the time is, where do they go before and, more importantly, after the spawn, or up here after the spring? And you know, there's quite a few ways to do this. The first thing I'm going to do post-spawn, especially if it's pretty close to the spawn, is I'm going to look at the structure to see if they're still there. If crappies are out in open water, they're a little bit easier to find, but if they're buried in structure, then trolling may not be the best way to fish for them. Then you might have to go to more direct methods like one pole in, jigging, et cetera, et cetera. But I look into the structure, and as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, I'm going to use my side vision from Ray Marine. I'm going to look down into that cover, try to figure out if there are some fish, which you can see there's a couple of fish relating to this structure right in here. Or recently, what I've really been having a lot of fun is what's on the left are these little underwater cameras. This micro view AV is going to run, this little micro camera is going to run right around $200–300. But with a little $3 part from Radio Shack, I can actually turn that little itty bitty camera into a high def view and be able to look into the structure. And when I say look into the structure, I'm also going to use it to look into the salad. When we got down into Florida, there's a lot of fish in the lily pads, a lot of fish up in the weeds. And this quickly, instead of having to fish all these pieces of structure or salad, is that I can look at them with the camera and find out if the crappies are there. Then if the crappies are there, then we can start to try to dissect that stuff. But fortunately for us, the fish were in the deeper water when we got to Florida. And, you know, no matter where you're at, post-spawn or far before the pre-spawn area, you know, you're looking for deep water holes. Anywhere where you've got a deeper hole or a deeper part of that lake or body of water or pond even, if I'm fishing farm ponds post-spawn, I'm going to go out away from cover and look towards that deeper water, because that's oftentimes where the fish are going to go. And rightly so, they're out there, they're looking for suspended forage. Crappies eat minnows. Now, of course, the young of the year, the smaller crappies are going to eat insects. And I think down in Florida, those crappies eat shrimp. That's why we have to use smaller, we're fishing in a lot of those bodies of water. But deeper holes are where a lot of times the suspended forage is at. You find the suspended forage, you find the fish. And then, you know, once I find those holes, or when I'm trying to look across a large expansive bowl or lake type of situation, I'm going to look for the fish. And when I start looking for the fish, let's take Red Lake way up in Minnesota, for example, which right now there's a bunch of crazy people driving out that body of water in trucks, ice fishing. But I'm going to drive across that with my boat, and I'm going to start an initial plotter trail, and I'm going to do a quick search as fast as my boat can go and still mark fish and try to locate those fish. Now, that initial plotter trail will show me where I might have missed something. So I can start looking around in that deeper basin or that deeper body of water, and I will store cords initially when I mark fish. Now, this one is fast moving. You can see here where I was cruising along, and then I shut down. That's where, you know, where the boat's tilted a little bit, it's gonna show a higher bottom, and then all of a sudden you shut down, and you're gonna get this little bump there. But as you can see here, I've got my finger just about ready to touch that screen wherever I'm gonna mark crappies. And these were crappies out on Red Lake, Illinois. I'm going to immediately touch save a coordinate here, save a coordinate at the end of the school, and then I can go back and I can circle around and I can fish those. Here's what it looks like when I save a coordinate. Here's a brush pile. Here's some fish inside of that brush pile. Here's where I've touched the screen and I've saved a coordinate on that unit. And then I can go back after I've stored several coordinates marking a school of fish. Then I can actually turn back around and I can fish for those fish. And when I talk about cruising for crappies or cruising to mark them, I've actually got my Ray Marine and my boat set up now to where I can cruise at 40 miles per hour and mark suspended fish. And I tell you what, when you really need to cover a lot of water and you need to break down that water fast, cruising at 40 miles an hour really, really helps. You know, and in other situations too, you can look for the gulls or you can look for the birds. And they'll show you where the fish may be. When you talk about big bodies of water, it's a small world till you got to try to find a fish in it. And, you know, stuff like cruising, marking fish, looking for birds feeding, these are all telltale signs that there's actually forage. You know, it's really easy a lot of times too where you see minnows or shad boiling on the surface. And that's another way to locate those fish. Finding fish, feeding fish is very important. And you know, it's always interesting. You run into somebody at the dock or at the boat ramp, and they've done really well. And if you have the first question that rolls out of your mouth is, "Hey, man, where'd you catch him?" Oftentimes, what you're going to hear back is in the mouth, out in the lake. I oftentimes don't try to work over an angler that hard at first. What I'm going to really look for is the depth. If they've got a cooler full of fish or a live well full of fish, I'm going to ask them what depth they were catching their fish at. And let's say they're going to say 15 feet, which on this contour map right here, this would be the 15-foot contour. Then I know that I've got a starting point. Now, his depth finder may be set up a little bit different than my depth finder. So if they say 15 foot, then I'm going to fish the 13 to 17-foot band. And sooner or later, that may uncover a school of fish. Now, what's really cool about finding the hot depth, they're established in the hot depth. If you establish a hot depth, let's say it's 15 foot, like that angler told me in the ramp, I can leave the crowd and go someplace entirely different where nobody's at and fish that 15-foot contour. It may be way on the other side of the lake or reservoir, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 miles away, 20 miles away in some instances. But once I nail down that hot depth, oftentimes that's a really great way to unlock that pattern. And that's why depth contours and having the best mapping available to me is so vitally important. And that's where I really get fired up about sonar logs, because we can take a body of water over here. Now, all of us, the community, can take that body of water that's in 5-foot contours on our map. We can just simply troll around or drive around. I use it a lot when I'm trolling, when I'm searching for fish. I'm recording on my unit and then send that into Navionics, and then they can update that chart. And this is the before and the after effect. So you can just see in living color how much more this is going to help you with your fishing if you've got better maps. The community's working on this. We're working on this. I've even got people that work and try to do this with their private lakes. That's why the freshest data is so important. And with Navionics, one of the products that I use a lot, Navionics Plus, and you've got to remember that I fish up in Canada, I fish down in Florida, I fish saltwater, I fish east, west. In some instances, that would require about 5 or 6 or 7 maps or electronic cartography. Now with Navionics Plus, I can download the bodies of water I want to fish. So if you vacation up north, you can use Navionics Plus up there. If you live in, say, Missouri or Arkansas, you can use Navionics Plus there. Anywhere you can actually use Navionics, you can use Navionics Plus. And that freshest data, you can update up to 1 year after the purchase and registration of your Navionics product. So that freshest data is really awesome. Now, if you've got cartography currently and it's out of date, they've got Navionics updates, which you can also use that as well. And again, I can't stress how important proper electronic setup properly and proper mapping or cartography is to success. Now let's get into where we're going to put our lures once we've established where those fish are at. Paying close attention, here's 16.6 foot of water. And that's over here where it got a little bit deeper. So if I look at these fish, they're going to appear at about right around 8 foot, all the way down to about 14 foot. So I'm going to want to put my lures at the crappie's eye level and above. And the reason that I want to do that is that crappies and most other fish have eyes on top of their head, they feed up. So with that type of control, I can actually place my baits. I can stagger my baits down here at the 14-foot level, and then I can put them all the way up here to the 8-foot level where we mark that school. And oftentimes, I'll even run baits a lot higher, realizing that your cone gets bigger, your transducer, when it sends out your sound from your sonar. You're not marking a lot of water way up here high in the water column. And as the day progresses and that top water column warms up, zooplankton starts moving around, algae starts to actually bloom, that ecosystem starts to fire up higher, and fish will move up higher. So where you've been marking fish in one area before and then they're gone all of a sudden midday, they didn't swim away. Oftentimes what they do is they just move higher up in that water column, and staggering baits will let you know where those fish are at. Oftentimes you don't have to have the perfect bait, you have to have the bait in the perfect depth. So staggering that will give you an idea where to find those fish at. And then once you find those fish, oftentimes if I start catching them or these higher rods start to fire, then I'll grab those lower baits and I'll pull them up higher and I'll put those where the fish are at. Now, let's talk about depth control or depth out of control. It was amazing when we won the Classic back in 2013. We're catching our fish anywhere from 6 to 12 foot down. Most of them were in that 8 and 12 foot range. And we had a lot of people come up to us, ask, how do you know how deep your baits are running? And, did you dive in the water? And I'm not kidding you. We had a lot of really strange questions. That's called depth out of control, not knowing where your baits are at. And I would ask people, how do you know where your baits are running, or how far out you put your baits? What's your depth control? And I would get answers like a cast and a half. I let out all the line on my reels, and that's where I set my lures. I go by feel, man. I go by feel. That's all fine and dandy, but that's depth out of control. I want to have my depth controlled, and that's why we use line counter reels. Now, you don't have to use line counter reels, but when you really need to put it back where it's at, duplication is the key. And what I mean by that is if I've got a bait out 100 foot, and it's say a flat line out 100 foot and the rod's in a certain position, and I catch a fish on that, I want to put that rod back out to 100 foot. I want to use the same rod. I want to use the same lure. I want to put that in the same rod holder. Duplication is the key. And if it works, do it again. We've had times before where we've had a line out 100 foot and it's firing. We put that exact same lure on another rod and put it out 100 foot and it doesn't get bit. You put it out 90 foot and all of a sudden it starts to get bit. Looking at the reels, then we've realized sometimes where one's at 100 has a little bit less line than the one at 90. Well, that different diameter on your spools. So when you're spooling up your bait casters or you're spooling up your spinning rods, fresh line is very important, especially when using monofilament, and also making sure there's the same amount of line on every reel. When I go to strip rods at the end of the day or strip some line off my reels, I'll lay 6 of them on the deck of the boat. I'll put the line counters or the clickers on, and then I'll strip out 10 foot, 20 foot. I'll grab all 6 lines and pull them out all at the same time so that I, again, maintain that same diameter and that same spool of line, also having identical reels as well. Now, you can also use clip-on line counters. They'll help you with your line control. You can count the passes. On this reel right here, this is a round reel, a 6500 C3 from Abu Garcia. A lot of people own these. When that line guide travels from one side of that reel to the other, you let out that line. I know that on a 6500 C3, that's about 8 foot, depending on the diameter of line. Could be as low as 6, could be higher than 8, but it's about 8 foot when this line guide goes from one side of the reel to the other. So if we want to set out 80 foot, we'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 passes of that line guide, and then boom, we're there. Another way to tell how much line you've got out is to meter your line. You can take Sharpie markers and put a black line at every 10 feet and then a red line at 50 feet. And then another 4 black lines every 10 feet and then another red line at 50 feet. Do it any way you want to do it. The problem with that is it gets a little difficult to see. Now, Berkeley just came out with ProSpec, which is a color metered line, and it's braid. That's a great line to use. When I'm trolling, I prefer to use monofilament in a lot of instances. And the main reason is I seem to lose a lot less fish. And also the precision trolling dive curves were formulated on 10-pound test diameter. I like using the bright green Solar Trilene XT. Now, this is a line that I've been using for well over 30 years. And like my dad said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The neat thing about Trilene is it's abrasion resistant, it's super strong, so it's going to take the wear and tear of slapping boards on and off all day long or dragging it over logs, whatever the case may be. You know, you can get a lot of time out of Trilene XT. Another good reason to use solar is I can see the lines going down into the water. I can get prepared and know where that fish is at by looking at the line. I've noticed that crappie anglers love bright lines, so this is an easy pitch, you know, to the crappie angler that, hey, this bright green line, the fish aren't going to see it. Sometimes I wonder if the fish don't see it, they don't follow it down to the line. So this is a great approach to use. Now, let's say we want another method in order to tell how much line we're going to let out. And in trolling, I like to use duct tape. And what I'm going to use duct tape for is X marks the spot. I'm going to take the back of my boat. I'm going to measure forward 10 foot. I'm going to put a chunk or an X of duct tape right there. Then when I'm setting lines and I'm letting out my line to say 100 foot, I put the line and lure in the water. I disengage the reel so it's on free spool, or I open up the bail on a spinning reel and I let it free spool and move the rod tip up to the duct tape that's 10 foot out. Clamp down on the line so no more comes out of the reel, follow the lure back, and then whoosh, let out another 10 foot. So that's 20, whoosh, 30, 40, 50, so on and so forth. So there you go. X marks the spot, and then you can mark it with duct tape. And we talked earlier about line counter reels. We showed bait caster reels. You know, you don't have to go out and buy or invest in a ton of equipment in order to be successful trolling. I know a lot of anglers that use long spinning rods and short spinning rods combined for flatlining jigs. For planer boards, we've got the little Offshore OR34 that works great with spinning equipment. So again, you can get by with pretty much all the tackle that you've got. and get rolling right away and get started on this. Now, figuring out how deep a jig is in the water is a little trickier right now due to the fact that most crankbaits have a dive curve. And similar to, there's a lot of really awesome apps out there right now. Precision Trolling Data also has an app to where, if you want to figure out how far to put that lure out, and here, like we talked earlier about Florida, those fish not being very deep in the water column, the fish might be 1 foot down, and you put out 3 foot of line. And you think about that, flat off the boat, that gets a little tough. That's where planer boards can really help out a lot. But again, with this app, this gives you an idea of how far to let out crankbaits. We don't have that ability so far with jigs. I think they're working on it right now. But what we've been using to not only put out lures quickly, and jigs especially, but also to get them to the right depth quickly and uniformly so that we have some type of control on this, is the Offshore Tackle Tadpole. This is the #1 tadpole. And what was interesting is we're using the #2 tadpoles a lot for walleye fishing, and all of a sudden here opens up a brand new reason to use this #1 tadpole. I call this the crappie tadpole. And you can see the dive curve here at 1 mile an hour. Where that dive curve starts out, let's go to 10 foot here, and let's roll up. If we want to get that jig down 10 foot, we got to let out 5 foot of line. So if we want to put that lure, or if we're going to put that line, if we're going to put out 10 foot of line, the lure is going to go 5 foot back. If we want that lure to dive down to 10 foot, we've got to put out about 12 to 13 foot of line. So it's just a little bit south of a 2-to-1 ratio when you're 1 mile an hour. Now, if you're going to go 1.5 miles per hour, 2.5 miles per hour, that's really pushing that top end of that crappie speed. But, now that we're able to do this and we're able to reach out to those spooky fish, we're finding that we can push the limit and get that speed up and go a little bit faster when you're using something like a tadpole for your depth situation. Now, let's roll back to the tadpole real quick. Why would we use this? How am I going to get away with putting out 3 foot of line or 5 foot of line or 10 foot of line flat off the boat? Aren't the fish going to spook? #1 is I'm going to use electric trolling motors in order to pull the boat along and to get to that right speed. In fact, you almost have to use an electric trolling motor in a lot of instances to get to 1 mile an hour or lower without applying some type of slowing device or some type of drift control when you're fishing. Another thing when it correlates to speed and using these tadpoles is, we were down in Florida last year, and where the light kind of went off, good friends of ours, we call him Chauncey, him and his partner of the year before had won the tournament down there in Florida. And they were letting out 100, 150. These guys are letting out close to 200 foot of line sometimes, and then pointing the rods really high up in the air. And so I'm thinking to myself, man, that takes a lot of time to let out that much line. It doesn't have a lot of control. If the wind comes up, this is really going to rock the program. This is really going to make it difficult in order to control where my lure's at. Now, if you turn and you're in shallow water and that stalls your inside lines, they're going to hit the bottom, and in a lot of instances, they're going to gum up, or they're going to weed up, or they're going to snag up, and you don't want to do that. So again, this is another great way to set lines fast, to control your depth, and to get lures out quickly in order to catch fish. What kind of lures are we going to use? Just about any jig you like to fish with. When I'm using planer boards, now I can step up to a bigger jig, a monster crappie jig. You get onto Grenada in the spring, and man, we're fishing with jigs I walleye fish with. We're using bigger hooks. We're using 2/0, 3/0, 4/0 hooks in some instances for walleyes, and it's not a lot of difference for crappies. I'm not using little hooks for crappies anymore. I'm using a lot of times really big hooks. If I do it myself, build my own jigs, that way I can actually put in the hook I want to fish with, and I can tie it up in the colors and paint it in the colors that I want to fish. Down in Florida, the little tube jigs are really popular. You put Mylar on the back of them, and then you spread that Mylar out, maybe put a small minnow or a piece of power bait on it. Finding out right now that artificial baits catch really big crappies. This is one right here that you don't have to put a minnow on it, but it works really well. And you get into double trouble. We pull 2 of these in tandem to where we use a a triple knotted loop knot on the front jig, and you go back about 2 foot back and use another triple knotted jig on that back jig. And we had several fish in that 2015 tournament. Bite was on. We had them going pretty good. You can see the little itty bitty minnow that we're using right over here on the side. We had numerous doubles, and that's where you had to figure out which one was the bigger fish and net the bigger fish and hoist the other one in, or net the double from the bottom up or from the up down. And we called that double trouble, but you know, that's a good problem to have when you're catching multiple fish. New product that I just helped and we're working on right now, and it just came out and hit the market for Blakemore. Roadrunners have caught more crappies than probably any jig out there. We're finding out that they're pretty good for walleyes too. Well, these jigs have a big hook in them, and I found they're awesome for crappies as well. So when I'm using a big bait, I'm using a big minnow, I'm using a big combo between the two, I'm starting to use these awesome walleye runners. Don't tell any of the crappie guys that these work on crappies, okay? Well, I guess I'm talking to crappie guys. All right. Hutch tackle. This is another jig I use a lot, again, because it's got a big jig hook on it. I use a lot of 16th, 8th, 3/32, and I really use a lot of 1/4 ounce jigs when I'm jigging the wood with these jig heads on them. The nice thing about them is you can either leave that wire shank straight, or it's pre-bent on a lot of the new jigs that are coming out now from Hutch. And as you could tell here, this one right here is one of my favorite crappie colors, this pink top with an orange bottom. Orange, you know, it seems like those are pink and orange are two of the most popular colors. Of course, it's got chartreuses. You get down into Florida and you better be using some of these chartreuse colors. They seem to pop a little bit better, especially in clear water. That's when we're going to get into the whites, and when it gets dark, we're going to get into the darks. So, you know, as you can tell, I'm about as confused on color as anybody, but I guess my biggest rules of thumb are is when the water's dirty, I'm going to be using these bright orange and pink colors. When the water's slightly stained or clear, then that's when I'm going to start shifting to the chartreuses and the whites and blues. Black, when it's overcast and we're really putting those lures up high in the water, black seems to have a really good appeal both in clear and in dirty water. And, you know, throw the book out the window. Don't take everything I say for gospel. This is something that you're going to want to experiment with and figure out what's going on. Again, when it comes to making your own jigs, we've got a lot of jigs like the Do-It Wire Keeper on the round head teardrop here, round ball jig here, and then the new bat jig, so that you can actually use those jigs as well and paint them up to your favorite colors. I'm going to tip these with a lot of power bait, a lot of artificials. Excuse me. And what we found out in the last tournament in Florida, there were a lot of the competitors that were trolling jigs that weren't using any bait at all. So here we're going through 10 dozen minnows a day, 15 dozen minnows a day, and we had competitors that never put a minnow on or were using very few minnows. My attitude is give them both. Give them the artificials, give them that. And as you can see here, excuse me, as you can see here, we've got some really, really awesome looking baits that are coming out. These two shapes, this Pro Grub and this Pro Shad, are all brand new. They've got Pro Twitch Tail colors. These aren't some of them, but this is the Twitch Tail minnow. I'm going to use these in clear water, or when I've got to have a bait that doesn't have a lot of noise or action to it. If I get into dirtier water, that's when I'm going to get into some of these shad or grub style baits. And it's amazing how you get into clear water and these baits don't seem to be nowhere near as effective as a straight bucktail or a mylar or an artificial bait like these Twitch Tail minnows. And again, don't take that for gospel. You play with it. I will tell you one thing though, one of my best colors or favorite colors to use, of course, is the chartreuse orange. And we're getting into a lot of purples right now. Those are really starting to hit. Pink and white, of course, is always good. And the program is as follows. Now, this right here is in the article that just came out in the recent March, April in Fisherman. And I got to give them credit for a lot of the illustrations in this program. In Fisherman still is the world's leading authority on fishing information. Matt Straw just wrote this article called Planar Boards and Jigs. And if I'm going to use line straight off the boat, then of course I'm going to just run light jigs really far back. And we use a 1-2 punch. I'll run flat lines straight off the boat. I'll run planar boards out to the side. Now, sometimes I'll run all planar boards if I'm in clear water or water that it seems like the flat lines aren't working. And in turn is, if I'm getting into a lot of fish on the flat lines, sometimes I'll pull the planar boards off the program. But very seldom will I pull the planar boards off the program. The planar boards are going to act and turn my boat into a great big combine from a 2-row picker. Or instead of mowing the lawn with a little lawnmower, I'm going to get a great big double-decker John Deere. This is the spread. You look at what we're doing down in Florida, this almost nails both tournaments. We're running 6 to 15 feet down to the Tadpole or straight back to the light jigs. And then you can see here we've got 10-pound mono. Might add a swivel in there to cut down on the line twist or put the swivel on the Tadpole itself. And then you've got a light jig with a fly, or you've got 2 jigs. But this is the planar board and jig program. Eliminating this Tadpole and running 6 foot back was the hot ticket the second day when we were in Florida. It seemed like just about every fish that wanted to eat was really high up in the water column. And here's what's going to really blow your mind. Our baits were so low underneath the surface, we actually had a bird, a tern, or a small gull. I don't know what that critter was. It was a nuisance species, I'll tell you that much. But it was hovering up above our planar boards, and then all of a sudden it dove into the water. The bird never went fully underwater, and it pulled the planar bird back 2 foot. So, you know, that tells you that that bait was 6-8 inches underneath the surface of the water. It was visible enough for that bird to see it 12 foot up in the air. You think about how visible that bait is to those fish down in that water, in that dirty water. Pretty amazing. And I think that's why those fish were feeding so high, is that the water got churned up from the cold front and the wind that had come in. And that always seems, that dirty water, start looking in that top of that water column whenever you've got that, when you're working that. What about pulling through the weeds? What if we've got some weed growth on the bottom of the lake? In some instances, you got up in Minnesota and places in the northern part of the United States or the Midwest, where we get cabbage that's 8, 10, 12 foot high. Well, then that's when a small spinner bait, something like a beetle spin, I'll take my jigs and take an add-on blade or a Roadrunner or a snap pin style bait like this one right here, and snap that onto that jig and make it a weedless jig. So that's a way to deal with the weeds. Speed. How fast are we going to troll? And we talked earlier about 1 mile an hour, 1.5. You know, 1.5 right now I'm finding is pushing the envelope, but I will pull a jig in a spinner or a crankbait 2.5 miles an hour. The magical speed seems to be 1 mile an hour. But don't hold me to that, because we had a tournament here not long, 1.4. I would encourage you to speed up and slow down. Make S-turns, especially when you're long lining or flat lining. S-turns will take the boat and pull the jigs. When you make a big wide turn, it will pull the jigs over virgin water or water where those fish haven't been spooked. And driving like a drunken sailor oftentimes will show you the speed that the fish want, the action that the fish want, and they'll also show you if they want it speeding up, slowing down. That change oftentimes will trigger fish. So, you know, play with speed and vary it. What I do, and doing a lot now, and I really got a chance this last year to use my power pole and my drift paddle, is I'm breaking it down now by putting this power pole in the water and putting the drift paddle just barely in that water. My speed will be about 1.3, 1.4, and then I can actually use my big motor, my kicker motor. When I'm trolling along in this instance, I'm using my kicker motor. You can see the bubbles coming off of it. Got that power pole in the water, troll along a little ways, tap the button on the lanyard that's hanging around my neck, and all of a sudden, boom, I put this power pole halfway, the paddle's halfway into the water, and I slow down the boat a little bit more. Not satisfied with going 1.1, put it all the way down in the water, and I found that it'll drive me down to about 0.7 of a mile an hour. So, you know, play with your speed, check out what that's doing. And we use the aluminum boat, the Ranger 1862 down in Florida. Wind coming up the second day, we had sustained winds and gusts well over 30 miles an hour. And that's where we would just get the trolling motor in the water. Normally, your boat would be drifting too fast, even at the slowest trolling motor speed. I put both drift paddles all the way in the water and turn the trolling motor back up to a normal 3 or 4 setting on the paddle or on the pedal itself. And in turn is with those drift paddles down in the water, all the way down in the water. It was a push me, pull you type of a thing. I maintained that 1 mile an hour we needed to go, but I was able to pull the boat along, keep everything straight. And once again, realizing speed is crucial. Pay attention to that speed. Now here's a spread. This is what it's going to look like when I'm pulling flat lines in conjunction with planer boards. You can see here I might have 2 rods sticking straight up in the air with those long lines going back. Or I'll oftentimes run a little 5-foot St. Croix right here. I'll run a longer one out flat. Maybe we'll have 3 flat lines and 1 board on each side, but it's up to you to figure out your spread. It's up to you to figure out how you want to spread lines, how you want to cover water, what works best for you. Again, I found that a mix of flat lines and planer boards is a great way to start, and then you just keen in on what the hot deal is. The rods that I'm going to use on that spread, for my planer boards, I feel there's no other rod to use other than the St. Croix Icon ECT80MN. It's the ultimate planer board rod. When we were developing the Icon series, that's the one that we built specifically for trolling with planer boards. Now you can flatline that rod and use it for a multitude of instances, but for the ultimate planer board rod, it's that 8-footer. I'll also use my walleye rods. You know, I'm a walleye guy. I'm loaded up with all these walleye rods, but man, they work good for trolling. This name should be iCrap for walleyes and crappie combination, because they've got a little 5-footer, they've got a 7-footer, they've got a 10.5, and they've got a 12-footer. We're also talking about maybe making some longer rods, but these are great for trolling flat off the boat. St. Croix's got a panfish series that works equally as well and works pretty good for spinning rods, and those get up in that 10 and 12-foot range. And then if I really got to reach it out there, I'm going to use my spider rig rods. I've got 14 and 16 footers from Ozark. Those are great rods to use as well, and they double duty. When you're pulling planer boards, let's say we're going to take all the lines off, the biggest key is you put them in the water where the line would enter the water on a flat line. In other words, if you've got a flat line out and you've got 100-foot of line out and 20 foot of it is out of the water and 80 foot of it is in the water, what you're going to want to do is snap that board on right where that line enters the water, not where your rod tip's at. That's going to let out another 20 foot of line, and it's going to make your bait go deeper. You want to clip the board on to the line where it enters the water. And then in turn is the front clip of that planer board goes on the line closest to the rod tip. The back clip goes back to that lure back there. And in turn is the more line you let out, the farther it gets away. Now, these are what have really helped us in both of those tournaments. Both of the Florida tournaments we got second in, and then we also pulled flat lines and we pulled jigs at Grenada. Where at Grenada, we're noticing that a lot of these guys are using 16-foot and even talking about 18-foot spider rig rods to get those boards away from spooky fish. When we won the Classic or the championship, the Crappie Masters Championship in 2013, we found that the farther we got the boards away from the boat, the better we did. And when we went back there last spring, we didn't have a lot of chance to really get the grip on it, but we caught some really nice crappies, including the fact that my personal best came, it was that fish that was a little over 3 pounds. It came on a jig, a 1/4 ounce jig, 4 foot behind the board. It had a tail mint on the one. Our big fish that we caught that day on a jig came on a ripple shed. But again, we had 4 foot of line behind that board with a 1/4 ounce jig. And again, getting them far, keeping them in formation, because a lot of times a fish might come and just grab that jig or suck on it and just pull it back, especially when you got a lot of line out behind that board. It'll just drag that board back a little bit. Using a tattle flag will help, but if you notice that something's out of formation, you could have picked up some debris, have picked up a small fish, or you might have picked up a big fish that grabbed a hold of it. You didn't see the board initially go back and spring forward, and that's going to swim along. But, you know, having formation, what's really cool about planer boards is when you take people that get bored normally from troll, planer boards give something to look at. It's a visual aid. It's like fishing with a bait. So don't be afraid to try planer boards. And You know, if you're going to get planer boards, again, I talked earlier about having the right mapping photography with Navionics, talked about having the right trolling rod. I firmly believe that if you're going to do this, this is a one-time purchase. Boards last, the right boards last a lifetime, and you look for the one with the sun. Look for the Offshore planer boards. They've been out the longest, American-made. They're also owned by a father and son, live in Michigan. They're traveling the crappie tour. They're working with Crappie Masters. They're also with crappie.com, to mention a few, Grizzly Jig. This is actually the best board to use. And if you want to learn a little bit more about some of these techniques, of course, we can ask some questions at the end of this webinar, but this new article that just came out in InFisherman, March, April of 2016, is planer boards and jigs for crappies. And this gives you a little preview. Here's what the cover looks like. Here's a neat little tag. We've got the thumbnail there. And I'll tell you, InFisherman is taking crappies pretty serious. I've also got an article with Matt Straw in the panfish guide. But here it shows and talks about this exact spread. It shows a lot of the techniques and everything that we're using in that article. So you know what? It all boils down to keeping your ducks in a row. You're going to want to cover more water. Mark those fish, find that big school of crappies first. It really will help you eliminate a lot of water and cut down on the time that a lot of times people just get out there and start trolling. And you know, if you set down in the wrong area of the lake, we found out that 3 days of trolling won't find the fish. But keep your ducks in a row, get your tackle. Great place to get a lot of this stuff would be Bass Pro Shops, who sponsors the Crappie Masters, also Grizzly Jig Company. They carry a lot of the product we're talking about here. Get the right cartography and get jiggy with it and get you some. And you'll find out that this is an awesome way to catch crappies. Thank you, everybody.
All right, Tommy, we got about 15 minutes left, I guess, for questions. One thing I'm going to comment on is, having been a prior product manager in other lives, not sure I'd ever call my rod the iCrap. But an interesting idea, but I just can't see that being an excellent ad campaign on that one.
No, but you know, it would be iconic wallet.
Yes. Hey, at least you know I was paying attention. So even if it is something to pick on you for. So, all right, I'm going to jump into a few questions here. So if anybody, again, if you've got questions, hit the Q&A button, fire away, and we'll try to answer the best we can here in the next 10, 15 minutes. I got one from David that's asked, any advice for Texas crappie?
Any advice for Texas crappie?
Correct, for crappie fishing in Texas.
You know, I lived in Texas years ago. We used to troll bombers flat off the boat. And we fished a number of reservoirs around the Belton, Texas area. Belton Reservoir was one of them. You know, the biggest thing that we did, it's the same anywhere else. I got to believe that if you use the same exact techniques we're talking here and you go out and you mark those fish and find those fish, you're going to be able to catch them. Texas has a lot of standing pole timber. And if you control right outside that standing pole timber, especially if a lot of that pole timber is getting some pressure, you might find that those fish get knocked out and suspend at the same depth that they might have been feeding on the pole timber. So that's another one. And I will be down there for the Crappie Masters one pole event. Doesn't look like we're going to be able to use planer boards or troll unless we hold on to the rods. We're going to probably be dipping, me and Mike Friend, my partner, in that event. But look me up down there, and I'll tell you everything I found out after the tournament's over. You're still muted, Paul.
Yeah, that would help. As far as line weight, I believe you answered that already. Typically, you're using 10-pound test, or was there another one that I missed?
No, 10-pound test is a great line to use when you're trolling, especially with planer boards. We're even stepping up to the 12-pound test. The reason I'm going to favor 10-pound XT is, again, I've been using it for over 30 years. But, you know, and that's the line that was used originally when they developed a lot of the dive curves. They're using that same diameter for those. But because it's so abrasion resistant, it works well. Now, if I was going to use a spinning rod, you know, I might air for 8-pound XL or Trilene Sensation in the bright green color, or Stren, you know, the golden Stren, Those are all great spinning lines to use because, again, they're going to be a little bit more manageable, and the board's still going to be able to grip on them. But the bigger the diameter of the line, the easier it is to work with planer boards. And I know that was a little bit more extensive answer than most people would want to hear, but it's pretty, to me, it's very important. All these little details really add up to success.
Now, when you troll, are you fishing mostly drop-offs and ledges, or what's your favorite structure to fish?
If I'm going to troll drop-offs or ledges, I'm going to use flat lines. And you know, if I'm my favorite presentation is whatever the fish are biting on. Where I really like to get it on with crappies and trolling is open water scenarios where they're suspended fish and they're out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of times, a lot of anglers aren't going to find those fish, and I can beat up on them and stay ahead of the crowd. If it's a 2-day tournament, it always seems like you have a few people show up on day 2. You can get away from them and go to another school that you've been leaving out there in the middle of that body of water. It's a great way to get away from other anglers. So if you don't like fishing the crowds, open water fish would be for you then. Still on mute, Paul.
Dang it, I keep trying to take it off. How long are your leads behind your tadpole?
The leads, man, that's a great question, and I think I missed that in the original seminar. They're usually going to run right around 6 foot. The clearer the water, though, sometimes the farther you have to go. And what's cool about those tadpoles with a 6 foot lead, 6 foot from the board, if you hold that icon way up with the board close to the tip of the rod, you can net the fish and then put out that exact same presentation again. And we're finding with these tadpoles that if it's set out 5 foot and another one set out 8 foot or 7 foot, that 2 foot could mean the whole difference in that bait being where the feeding fish are at.
All right, let's see what else we got. Will Buchanan, man, I can't answer that one. He's got Hummingbird, Lowrance, or Garmin for crappie. He wasn't paying attention. We talked about enough of the Ray Marine stuff. So, Will, you're not getting that an answer on that one.
Well, we could say that as long as they take Navionics, but you know, I'm marking so many fish right now with Ray Marine. I swear the unit is on similar. I've never marked this many fish. And when I can set my boat up to go 40 miles an hour and mark suspended fish out in the middle or brush piles or you name it, there's times we've been going from one spot to the other, which was the case in the 2015 Florida tournament where we got second, marked a pot of fish. I looked at Kyle and said, that's a bigger school of fish than we're fishing. We stopped and started there and we never left it. So, you know, it's, to me, the answer is real simple. I've run them all, and I've found that Ray Marine works the best for me.
Now, when would you troll with jigs and boards versus spider rigging?
You know, when we were fishing in Grenada, the fish were in 3, 4, 5, 6 foot of water, and the water was cold. A cold front had rolled in. The water was dirty. And we spider rigged, but we had to move to another area, and that's kind of was the going fashion. We would spider rig through the tobacco stems, et cetera, et cetera. I guess a roundabout way to answer your question, I really wish I would have had more time to throw out a couple of planer boards and spider rigs in that tournament in order to figure out if those bigger girls would have bit that. But when you got to slow down, and you got to go 0.3 of a mile an hour, 0.2 of a mile an hour, 0.4 of a mile an hour. I think that's where spider rigging has a little bit of advantage on planer boards. We're working with our smaller OR34 crappie board right now, and we're finding out that we can go slow with that. So, you know, don't hold me to it, but I would say that planer boards will work in instances like that. Let's take another scenario, though. When you really have to tighten things up, when you really can't cover a large swath of water, when you're around a lot of other anglers, you know, planer boards can get pretty invasive, especially when you run one 10 foot by the bow of another boat. So we have to respect the other anglers that are out there, especially in trolling scenarios. So in those instances, you know, spider rigs may shine a little bit more than planer boards.
Popular one coming up here, Tommy, is if you're running a 1/16 ounce lead head behind your tadpole, do you add any depth to the dive curve?
You know, a little bit heavier jig, like a 1/4 ounce, is going to make a difference. And that's, you know, rise over run as far as your lead is concerned. You get in clear water, put the tadpole down in the water, look how far down below the tadpole that jig is running. If you're in doubt, put the jig a foot behind the tadpole if it's a heavier jig. But with a 16th ounce, I really don't think, as long as you stay under 6 foot, I don't think it's going to give you any more than a foot of depth at 1 mile an hour. Now, when you slow down, then that's going to drop both the tadpole and that jig is going to drop exponentially. So play with it, but you know, lighter jigs with a tadpole, you don't have to use a heavy jig. Reason a lot of times the guys are going to troll heavier jigs is they can cast them out and get them out faster, or they can get them down to 10 or 12 foot with a 100-foot of line out on a 1/4 ounce jig. You don't have to do that when you're running tadpoles. With tadpoles, you pay attention to the dive curve, keep it going about 1 mile an hour, and then when you vary your speeds, if you get bit, just duplicate that presentation.
All right. Well, Will's got a sense of humor. Will, I was only picking on you as far as hummingbird Lowrance. It's all what you like to use. But he does have a follow-up question there, Tommy, and that is, which Raymarine unit should Will buy?
You know, I really am starting to lean towards putting forth the most your budget can bear and getting the best one possible. I ran everyone I could. Since I've gotten on with Raymarine, I've ran all the way up to the 12-inch A and E series, which are going to run 2,500 to 3,500 copy, with accessories and everything included, all the way down to the 5-inch Dragonfly. And I got a lot of the walleye guys make fun of me for running those little units, and they say, why do you when you can get anything you want from Raymarine, why do you run that little unit? And I'm like, well, most of the people that I'm going to talk to out in the public, that's what they fish with, the smaller units. So I've got to be able to speak intelligently. The Dragonfly units are blowing my mind too. So, you know, I'm gonna go back on buying the best you can for your budget. If your budget is, say, $500-700, you're going to be able to get a really awesome Dragonfly unit for the money, and you can even get side imaging for right around in that price, or excuse me, side vision for right around that price range. So just go for the one that you can afford and get the best you can get. And we never remember the price of stuff like that a year or two down the road when it's helping us catch fish and we're satisfied.
All right, Tom, we got a few more minutes. Let me see if we can grab a couple more on here. How long, Lee wants to know, how long do you use your trolling technique before switching up?
You know, I've really been trying to switch with my trolling technique. I'm assuming he's talking about maybe going to one pole or going to another technique. Now that we're starting to, and I didn't include it in this presentation, I didn't have time to get a photo or an illustration that explained it, but we're starting to throw some spider rig rods out the front of the boat and throw flat lines out the back of the boat and giving them a dual combination. So to answer that question, I'm having a hard time abandoning trolling because it always seems like I can get onto a program that catches fish. But when I'm in those bodies of water, like some of those Missouri reservoirs and Grenada, when the water's really, really dirty and it's pre-spawn and those fish are in a slow funk and you got to slow down, then I may abandon trolling fairly soon. The biggest key is to keep changing things regardless of what you're doing. And the definition of insanity is to continue to do something that isn't working and think that sooner or later it's going to work. So keep changing it up, don't get lazy, and you'll experience a lot quicker success that way.
All right, and this might be our last one here. Ben wants to know, can you tell the difference in feeding fish and non-feeding fish on your electronics?
Sometimes when you're going slower, you can. Fish, sometimes you get on a body of water and you realize that if they're at a certain depth, then they're going to be aggressive and active fish. So let them get up if you're marking fish at that higher depth. Other times you may see them crashing balls of bait. Whenever you've got fish suspended around those balls of bait, they may be somewhat inactive. But sooner or later, if you see them start to crash into bait and feed into bait, it's all based on time on the water. The one thing I will tell you, though, is that I'm learning with crappies, even more so than walleyes, is somewhere, somehow, those things are always eating. And we're figuring out ways, these spooky fish with planer boards, to reach out to these inactive or neutral or negative fish and trigger a response with jigs or with crankbaits, and we're able to catch them. And Paul, I'll go as long as we need to go to answer questions, but if we're on a certain time limit, we got to shut it down. I want to remind everybody, if they go to Tommy Skarlis on Facebook, which is spelled Skarlis, they can always ask me questions on my fan page.
Yeah, we've got another one following up, and they'll end up kicking us off. So I want to make sure we try to end on without getting cut off. So I'm going to do one more real quick. I think we can squeak it in. In northern Minnesota, at what temperature do they move out of the cover and out into open water?
You know, oftentimes I find that the fish are going to be shallow, especially the males, until that spawning's done. And so I couldn't give you an answer as far as temperature is concerned. I'm kind of still a newbie on a lot of that stuff. I would pay attention to that 60, 65, 70 degree mark. And there seems to be a little bit of a movement in that temperature range in some of the bodies of water that I'm going to. But there's been times where the water temperature's up in the 80s and those fish are still shallow. You get sun and dock fish. Those fish are shallow in the winter, and they're shallow all the way up into the summertime in a lot of the bodies of water I'm at. So I wish I could give you a definite answer on that. The biggest thing is, like I said, is get you an underwater camera, look around in the shallows with that aqua view, and also let the fish tell you where they're at sometimes too.
There we go. So on that note, Tommy, I'm going to end the webinar for the day. I want to remind everybody again, as Tommy mentioned, if you've got additional questions, check out his Facebook page. Tommy, you want to mention that one more time?
Yeah, if they just want to go to Facebook and find my athlete page, which is Tommy Skarlis, Skarlis.
Okay, if you've got
it's one that Paul actually brushes his teeth to in the morning.
Dude, I can't wake up without checking out your Facebook page. It's my morning coffee to see what's new in the world of Tommy. So additionally, if you have any other questions, again, send them to Tommy. We will have this webinar up on the Navionics website on navionics.com under our webinars hot link, probably sometime by Friday. So if you want to come back and take any notes or rehash what was said, feel free to visit it. And Tommy, I want to thank you very much for helping us out with this and educating people a little bit more on your trolling techniques for crappie.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Really appreciate y'all.
Have a good night, everybody. Good fishing.